Irish Nation, welcome back to the show. Episode 5, Season 4. We're here to look at the Notre Dame schedule, and Mike and I are very excited to announce we have survived our first takes of being YouTube video content creators. Very exciting. We're learning a lot. We have a ways to go. We know it's a little rough around the edges, folks, but we got the best production crew here in the country, led by Mike. He is the production crew. Mike, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Great to be back. And I have to say, Brett is really excited for this episode. This is the first episode where we actually have the ability to insert sound bites as we're performing. I'll call it performing. Yep, there you go, right there. Right in the middle of a remark that I'm making. So
yeah,
I think it's a little dangerous. Brett basically has the football. He has the nuclear codes right here. I actually don't have access to the soundboard, so it's basically whoever signs in and sends the link. So we'll have to switch it up at different points in time. But I'm kind of living at his mercy right now.
I got to give Lou Holtz his due. I'm going to redo that. That was poorly timed on my part.
After we win the game, if Miami wants to fight, fine, we'll meet them in the alley. And if they do, you say Jimmy Johnson's asked for me.
I'm going to love that all year. I can't play that enough. So yeah, I've got sound bites ready to go. We're diving right in. But Mike, let's just get right into the show. We're here to look at the schedule this week, overall season preview, and we'll come back at the end of the show here and go through our win-loss predictions. And, look, we tell our listeners all the time, we try to not have hot takes. We try to bring data to the table, and we try to have a glass half full approach, but be on the more positive side. The data side of that equation, trying to bring, the stats to our predictions, it's getting harder and harder. I know a lot of college football fans are frustrated by the transfer portal. They're frustrated by NIL. We are too, and maybe for a different reason. I think the transfer portal is great for players. I think it's about time that if a coach can leave, a player can leave. If a coach can get paid, a player can get paid. But it's really hard to follow the stats. And just a couple examples, we're trying to do these, season previews. Georgia Tech had 32 transfers this year. Texas A&M had 31 transfers this year. Like, there's two teams where over a third of their roster is just completely different. And, Georgia Tech is top 10 in returning starters. They got a bunch of guys back, but every single guy on the bench basically said, I'm not getting playing time. Like, I'm out of here. And so, there it's more of like a depth issue. So you got to count that in the narrative. You take Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher leaves. They had all these massive NIL deals and a bunch of their 5-star recruits, a bunch of their best players like Walter Nolan, number 2 recruit in his class, Evan Stewart, number 6 recruit in his class. They're like, see ya, I'm off to Ole Miss, I'm off to Oregon. And they're big time players that are getting replaced. They've got an offensive tackle who's going to be starting from Fresno State. Like, I don't know how to put prediction behind how's the Fresno State guy going to look at Texas A&M and how are they going to look when their 5-star defensive lineman leaves. Like, there's just so many changing narratives to the transfer portal where I want to caution our listeners. The schedule preview is getting harder and harder every year. At best, we're trying to put narrative around these teams. I think trusting Bill Connolly and SP Plus, who we love Bill on this show. We love all the efficiency metrics he's brought to the game. But you gotta, I think, discount him in some ways just in this era of transfer portal and just constant roster churn.
Definitely, Brett. And I think what we're saying is we're talking about the season preview in particular. As we get to week 7, week 8, at that point, the data actually gets very predictive and becomes very reliable. But the season preview, I would say this is an area a couple of years ago where we felt really good relying on the data. We could look at Bill Connolly. We could see what he was predicting. This was before the transfer portal really ramped up. But now, Brett, as you're saying, as there's so much turnover on these rosters, it's hard to predict. There could be a guy on Alabama who's buried and potentially a future star, but wasn't happy with playing time, jumped to a kind of a middling P5 team and becomes an absolute stud the next year and completely changes the trajectory of that team. It's just really hard to anticipate that. And then you mentioned depth. That's another factor that you really don't see exactly how that's going to play out until later. So we've had to rely for this season preview a little bit more on narratives. We had to rely a little bit more on what we're hearing from beat reporters, from people who are close to respective programs. So whereas in the past, we could just look at the data to get a pretty good idea of how a position group could be. Now, if someone who's close to a program says that the interior offensive line is looking weak, we have to kind of go more with what they're saying anecdotally, that it's carrying a little bit more weight. at least at this stage before the season starts.
Absolutely. I pulled up, two teams on the schedule, Georgia Tech and Stanford. They were both tied for seventh in returning starters with 17 returning starters, but both in the top 10, both on our schedule. Georgia Tech was a 7-6 team. And you'd say, gosh, that's probably pretty good odds that, they might jump up to be an ACC contender. And you kind of got to be like, well, not so fast when you lose 31 guys to the portal. So every single one of your backups is gone. I mean, by October, November, we get them on October 19th. I'm really glad that game is kind of in the second half of the season. I think Georgia Tech is a team going to be injury prone, going to be, more difficult for them to have a next man up mentality behind their initial starters. Stanford, sure, they're seventh in returning starters, but they stunk. And you're like, well, why are all these guys back? Why didn't they transfer? No one else wanted them. No one else wanted the Stanford starters. And you look at other teams and it's like Florida State is 57th in returning starters. Well, they lost 10 guys to the NFL draft, 22 guys go out, but they bring in a ton of, 5-star, 4-star guys. They got 5 different guys that were backups for Alabama and starters for Alabama that left when Nick Saban retired. So Florida State, sure, maybe doesn't have as many returning starters as a Georgia Tech, but when you're bringing in 5 guys from Alabama to supplement who you lost in the draft, you're probably feeling pretty good, or at least, better than you otherwise would be if you were, say 5-10 years ago staring at 57th in the country in returning starters. So again, it gets difficult for us. It gets difficult for fans. That's just a different kind of way to think about what is this transfer portal done. It's 1 year free agency. It's 1 year contracts, and it's no longer just the QB. It's no longer just those kind of 1 or 2 grad transfers. It's entire rosters making big moves. Turning to the schedule, I think the biggest narrative of this entire show is one of the easiest schedules we've had in a long time. Phil Steele has us pegged at the 57th easiest schedule in the country, pretty middle of the pack. We actually finished last year at 60th. Over the last 15 years, we've averaged about a top 25 schedule. So this one, definitely on the easier side. And I think the other thing, Mike, we don't have a big marquee game. There's no Ohio State. There's no Clemson on the schedule. In fact, after the opener, Notre Dame is predicted to be the favorite in every single game this year. If you look at the near automatic wins, how do you think through that kind of easier part of the schedule? And then maybe we can come back to some of the tougher games.
Well, I think you have to start with how much we're favored. And granted, we mentioned you got to take the data with a bit of a grain of salt, but it does give, if we're going to use SP Plus here, it does give a pretty significant point spread in Notre Dame's favor for 8 games. So on a neutral field, SP Plus is predicting that we will be 24 points or higher favorites in 8 games. And if you just take that, if you take that spread face value, Notre Dame is overwhelmingly the favorite from a probability standpoint. These are essentially cupcake games. So the games that fall into this bucket are Georgia Tech, Miami of Ohio, Purdue, Virginia, Stanford, Northern Illinois, Army, and Navy. So I think if you're looking at this, if you're looking at our team and the talent that we have and how we're expecting that team to perform, me personally, I have them pegged as it's looking like a top 5 team. And Brett, I know you feel very similarly.
Of those games, which one scares you the most? Like, I get it. There's, 8 games where ND should be huge favorites. Is there any in that list where you're like, yeah, but I've got this date circled as kind of the watch out?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, these should all be fairly easy games. You never just want to assume that because we've have had some letdown games in the past. But I think Georgia Tech, if I had to pick one, they seem like they could be. I think plucky is a word that one of your friends had used before to describe them, Brett. I think that's a good word to describe them. They're the only team in this group that has a top 50 offense. Haynes King is in his second year as a starter. He's a former 4-star recruit for Texas A&M. So I think, and I think another element here is that they're going to be used to playing a lot of tough teams. So they have one of the hardest schedules out there. So there are 2 ways that you could think about that. One, it could wear them down. Or if they're a team that's going to play spoiler at some point, if they play a lot of good teams, they're not going to back down. They'll be used to playing a higher level of competition. Their schedule this year, they have Florida State, they have us, they have Georgia, Miami, NC State, all ranked teams. We're the second highest ranked team on that schedule. So there's an element here where I'm not saying that they would be, kind of afraid of the level of competition against us, but they're going to be very comfortable playing against top teams when they play us. And so I think if I had to pick one, it would be Georgia Tech. Now, that being said, I think because we are such big favorites in all these games, we have a very high floor for this season. That's 8 games where we're favored by 24. If you're looking for a floor, that tells you that something would have to go pretty sideways for us to not win 8 games, basically. So for me, I'm excited looking at this. I'm saying, wow, okay, our floor is 8 wins, and that's just where we're starting right now. That's a phenomenal place to start, and it also indicates that our schedule is a little bit easier than what we've seen in some other seasons.
Absolutely. And I think, another way to put those 8 games into context, I never like writing off teams, but you mentioned it. Georgia Tech is the only top 50 offense that we play, according to Bill Connolly's SP Plus preseason rankings. And again, looking at kind of play-by-play efficiency data, the only top 50 defense in that group of 8 teams is Miami of Ohio. So the way to think about that from my perspective is Notre Dame's offense and defense are both in Bill Connolly's top 10. So both sides of the ball are going to be at least on one side of the ball a heavy favorite. If not in really 6 of those 8 games, on both sides of the ball, we're going to have both by far and away the best offense and by far and away the best defense, where it's like you could just throw up a goose egg, like just a total dud game on offense or just totally not show up and be sloppy on defense. And you should have enough firepower to easily win those games. So that leaves 4 games. I really view this as a 4-game slate for Notre Dame. Texas A&M in the opener, Florida State at home in November, Louisville at home in mid to late September, and then, of course, the rivalry game, USC. All those teams are sort of borderline top 25. Interestingly, I think this is the first schedule in a while where Notre Dame is preseason ranked higher than every team on its schedule. We mentioned earlier, except for Texas A&M, Notre Dame is favored in every game. Notre Dame's actually favored against Texas A&M according to SP Plus. They're also favored against Texas A&M according to ESPN's win predictor. So there's even different metrics where you can not even squint, but just flat out say the metrics say Notre Dame's favored in every single game, including those 4. Mike, let's just maybe rotate through them. Which one do you think is the hardest game? And then I'll go with the next hardest, and we'll just go down the list here and kind of do brief previews here on each of these squads.
The Texas A&M game, that's the one game where technically we're not favored. Vegas has the spread. They're giving A&M. They're expecting them to beat us by 3 points. So I do personally think that we're going to win that game, but there are a lot of elements here as to why that is such a tough game, and we're going to go into that a lot more on our next episode when we do a deep dive into Texas A&M. We're going to go, position by position, talk about their strengths and weaknesses. But I can just kind of hit high level the reasons why this is such a tough game. So I think one, people like to talk about the environment. So Texas A&M is notorious for having one of the toughest road atmospheres in the entire country. Ask any SEC fan, and they know that if you go to Kyle Field, it's going to be a really rough environment. And then for this game in particular, the temperatures are going to be really high. I grew up in the South. I would say that when I grew up there, I was used to these 100-degree plus temperatures. Now I live in Los Angeles, and I think living away from that, I've gotten pretty soft. When I come back home and I feel it, it really does kind of punch me in the face. So I think for us, we're going to have to be able to adjust to that climate, to the really rowdy road crowd, the really hot temperatures. And I think we're going to be able to do that, but that is an element that you don't necessarily have to deal with every single game. And then equally important is just the level of talent. So they've had a lot of turnover from the transfer portal this past year, but they're still a very talented team, in particular on the defensive line. And if you compare the biggest strength on their team, which is the defensive line, to the biggest area of concern for us, which is our offensive line, I think that's an area that makes a lot of fans very nervous. So I think for me, those are the biggest factors to weigh here. There are other considerations here too, like Mike Elko. We think he's a really good coach, and we'll think he'll do a good job. And we can get more into that as we get into the preview next episode against A&M. But for me, I think it's the talent level, it's the defensive line versus the offensive line, and I think it's this road atmosphere at Texas A&M that's going to make this a tough one.
Yeah, I think by far that is the toughest test for a team that, look, that was Jimbo Fisher's last year. Clearly hasn't met expectations the last few years, but top 5 recruiting classes. Yes, they lost some talent to the portal. But overall, look, like they've underperformed expectations for a while, but the talent is there and fully expect that to be a tough matchup despite kind of a disappointing 7-5 season a year ago. And I think 5-7 didn't even make a bowl game the year before that. So looking to see them really take a step forward this year. I think I got to tip my hat on this next game. I went back and forth on this one, but I think it's still got to go to Florida State as the second toughest matchup. Mike Norvell deserves a ton of credit for the improvement that they've pulled off in Tallahassee. Undefeated regular season, largely built it by the portal. Of course, the devastating QB injury to Travis that really threw off their playoff hopes and got snubbed by the committee. Pretty controversial. Of course, then got their doors blown off when a bunch of guys sat out in their bowl game against Georgia. But the reason to believe this is a doable game is, first off, ton of talent lost to the NFL. Jordan Travis at QB, as I mentioned, got hurt at the end of the year, but he's drafted by the Jets. Their leading rusher, Trey Benson, he's gone in the third round. Their top 2 wide receivers, Keon Wilson. Nope. Johnny Wilson, Keon Coleman. There we go.
Oh, that might be a Malort shot. I don't know.
Oh, no. Malort shot. Okay, not Deion Colsey. It's Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson. The Malort shot counters up to 1.
We need to get an audio clip.
And I know just the one. I got it in mind. I already know. Right.
Don't tell me. I'm just surprise me. I want to see. I want to see it in action. Yeah.
Our buddy Jim is going to know exactly what clip I'm going to. But yes. And their top tight end, Jaheim Bell, also drafted in the NFL. And then a bunch of guys lost to the transfer portal. So a bunch of guys back in the transfer portal. Notre Dame will know their QB very well. DJ Uiagalelei. I got that one right, Mike. I've been practicing all week. Uneven career. We saw him at Clemson. He then transferred to Oregon State. He's now going to Florida State. Big time guy, but a ton of unknown. Malik Benson coming in from Alabama and Jaylen Brown from LSU. So they're going to have 2 new wide receivers that were both pretty high-power productive guys in the SEC a year ago. So just so much change at Florida State that I think sitting here today, it's hard to know what they're going to look like in November. But it just seems tough that they're going to replicate what they did a year ago. It just seems tough that if you want to build back that transfer portal, churn, it's hard to do every year. Like, I think the team that Mike Norvell is building for this year is to then stack another transfer class on top of the year after that. And I think it's just hard to replicate that every year after you lose 10 guys to the NFL. That's shown, by the way, in the analytics. SP Plus predicts us as a 6.5 point favorite in that game. Obviously, a lot of football to play between now and then. But that's, potentially the number 12 team in the country, according to SP Plus, number 10 in the AP poll. So the media has them a little bit higher. Who knows? Like, that's a game that we could be sitting here at the end of the year and saying, what were we saying Texas A&M was the toughest matchup? Like, Florida State is, a clear playoff team, clearly going to repeat in the ACC. And we might also sit here saying, you guys had them in the top 4. Like, they're back to 7-5. And, Mike Norvell's just like completely starting over with this roster in a year. So I think this is one where huge, massive unknown, but you have to give Mike Norvell some credit for the blueprint he's put out. And he's brought in the guys like DJU and Malik Benson and the others I've mentioned to say, you know what? That team by November could be pretty dangerous.
Definitely. I think it's interesting. I think one theme from these first 2 teams that we've mentioned, the 2 toughest tests, is that the transfer portal is such a critical element for both of them. And so I think if we had to pick right now, I think that these are the 2 toughest games. But if we get to the end of the year and both teams have completely collapsed, or just they didn't gel, or it didn't work out for some reason, that wouldn't be shocking either. It's just, as we've mentioned a few times already this episode, this transfer portal element just adds so much uncertainty. I think even Florida State last year, going into last year's season, they were not particularly highly touted going into that year, and had a very magical season. It's just these transfer portal additions worked out extremely well for them. And going into this year, on paper, compared to where they were on paper at the beginning of last year, this year's team is actually better than what you would have expected at this same point last year. Now, Brett, as you mentioned, it's really tough to recreate magical seasons like that over and over again. They picked up a lot of talent from the portal. They picked up some guys from Alabama, and that's reflected in their talent composite. So the 24/7 talent composite, basically, it's an index for what is the overall talent level on a team across all classes. They actually had a nice little increase. I think they were near 20 or something. Maybe they're like 21 last year. They're up to 13 this year. So at least from a recruiting service standpoint, they believe that Florida State on paper does have some talent, but it does remain to be seen whether or not that's going to be able to translate into an effective team. So now I'm going to move on to USC, and I think another theme here is this is another. There's uncertainty here, I would say, for different reasons. Now USC has certainly used the transfer portal as well, but I think it's we're now at year 3 of the Lincoln Riley era, and it's safe to say that the honeymoon has worn off. They had a very strong first season. Obviously, they ended up losing their bowl game. I think it was to Marshall. No, it was Tulane, right? I think was that the
They lost in the Cotton
Cotton
Bowl
Bowl
to Tulane, to the Tulane
Tulane. All right,
Green Wave. Yeah,
so I remember that.
46-45.
Yeah, I remember being on a run when that was happening. I went on a run because it looked like the game was over, and then USC had a pretty historic collapse. So I think that first year USC fans were feeling pretty good. That bowl game put a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth, but I think what really put a bad taste in their mouth was last year. So with Caleb Williams, was overwhelmingly the top player in all of college football. No question, he was going to be the number one pick in the NFL draft. They only went 8-5, and then since the season has ended, he's made some comments implying that the ND rivalry may not be core, may not be critical, and he's even expressed some frustration with joining the Big Ten. So people who are critical of Lincoln Riley because they think he likes to dodge the competition, I don't think that has necessarily helped alleviate any of those concerns. So I think the fan base right now is getting a little anxious with Lincoln Riley. They're not necessarily seeing the results they want. And he's also made a couple comments about the program that doesn't necessarily align with their culture. And moving it more into the team itself and who their key personnel are, you got to start with what they lost. I already mentioned Caleb Williams, phenomenal player. One of those players that once you just watch him play once, it's immediately apparent how talented he is.
Unreal. They lost to Notre Dame last year in a resounding blowout. And I remember sitting in that stadium thinking, yeah, but there's one quarterback in this game who's made throws that I don't know if I've seen 2 college quarterbacks ever. Like, it was Andrew Luck level skill. And it was just like totally overwhelmed by our defense and just still not enough. But totally agree. Like, Caleb Williams, leaving that team here, huge setback.
Major setback. And look, he went number 1 in the NFL draft. He's on the Bears right now. And Lincoln Riley, you got to give him credit for his track record. He has continually found, anytime he's had to find another quarterback, he's done it successfully. And he's done it at a pretty historic rate. With the if you just look at his track record of number 1 picks, whether it's Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, like any of these guys, it's pretty remarkable how consistent he has been at finding elite quarterbacks. So I would suspect that the next man up is going to be a really good player for them. But Caleb Williams is at such a high level. I think even if this person is a top 5 quarterback in all of college football, that's still going to be a step back from Caleb Williams. So I think you start there. And I think the person who's going to be stepping in for USC is Miller Moss. He's the heir apparent here. He looked really good in the Holiday Bowl last year. Again, it's just one game, but it looked like he certainly had their system down. It seemed like he was very comfortable stepping up to that starting QB role. And he was a top prospect as well. So he certainly seems to have a lot of the physical tools to be able to be another good QB prospect. And I think moving more into other elements of their offense, they also added Mississippi State transfer Woody Marks, who I think has a chance to be very productive for them in the backfield. But overall, I think with USC, their offense is going to be effective. They're going to have good receivers. They're going to be able to put points on the board. The question just remains the defense. And this has been the question the entire time that Lincoln Riley has been at USC. It's been the thorn in his side the entire time. They did hire a new coordinator finally. I think a lot of people thought that this was long overdue, but they finally did. They finally did switch coordinators. They added Johnson Lynn from UCLA, but the overall depth and talent remain a question here. So I think big picture, I'm expecting USC's offense to remain strong. I would imagine they take a little bit of a step back here just because you're moving on from Caleb Williams. Even if the next guy is really good, it's still going to be a step back. But the defense, we'll have to see. I think the defensive coordinator change is a nice step. I don't know that. I think the problems here are so deep that it would take a couple years to be able to build the necessary personnel to be able to build a strong defense. So I would imagine they probably are able to improve, but it's unclear exactly how much they'll be able to improve. So I think for Notre Dame, I think this is a matchup if our offense is, and this is the last game of the year, so hopefully by that point our offense is humming. We've our inexperience on the offensive line is no longer an issue. The Mike Denbrock offense is just explosive and flying all over the place. And we have a big mismatch against their defense. And then we know on our end, our defense is we think it's going to be one of the best defenses in the country. So even if USC has a top offense, I think we should be able to bottle them up. We bottled them up last year, and I think it should be even easier this year. I think our defense is even better than last year. And I think their offense is worse. So the only thing that gives me pause here is that this game is in Los Angeles, and I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, we always seem to struggle at the Coliseum. And it's not. I've been to the Coliseum many times. I wouldn't say when I'm sitting there, it feels like a particularly intimidating environment, but for whatever reason, it just seems like we do not have our best games at this venue. That being said, I think that this is a matchup that should bode well for us, Coliseum notwithstanding.
It's pretty interesting. I mean, you mentioned some of the transfers they're coming in and hope to hit the ground running like Woody Marks and Kyle Ford, but this is a team that of Power 5 schools are number 4 in the fewest returning starters. So they had a really good offense last year. Only 3 guys are back starting from that squad, and none of them are quarterback, running back, or wide receiver. I think Zachariah Branch and Deuce Robinson were some rotational guys, but looking to step up into starting roles and really kind of a complete reboot on the offensive line outside of Jonah Monheim at center, and I think Mason Murphy was kind of starting by the end of the year. But I mean, a pretty complete reboot with 8 new starters on offense. And then you're right, the defense stunk, but they only got 4 guys back on that defense. They're bringing in, at least when I looked yesterday, 5 transfers will be starting on that defense, and 3 more are expected to see heavy rotation play on the defensive line and at cornerback. And so, again, like when you're already when your great offense loses everybody and you're already really bad defense is like, you know what, we're starting over, new coordinator, whole new slate of guys coming in, and they only got 3-4 starters back on both sides of the ball. This is a slippery time for Lincoln Riley. And I remember, we did an episode when he got hired a couple of years ago, Mike, and we were talking about, like, is the rivalry going to be back? Like, is Marcus Freeman and Lincoln Riley, like, it's hard to imagine Lincoln Riley doesn't figure out being a top 10 team. He's figured out how to not be a top 10 team.
Yeah.
Pretty shocking the fall from grace out in LA.
It's interesting. I think when you look at the roster, there are elements here that would suggest that they could be a good team. The 24/7 Towel composite has number 15, but so much of that is just weighted on their offense. So it's just they have a complete imbalance there. And I think, again, that's just further evidence as to why Lincoln Riley has had so many issues here. I think, yeah, like you said, Brett, it looked like this was potentially going to be a perennial top 10 team, a really good matchup for us. This year, SP Plus has them around a top 20 team. I think that's certainly possible. But to me, this is a USC team that, I mean, this season could go a lot of different ways for them. I think kind of hanging around the edge of the top 25 for me, that kind of feels about where I would expect them to be this year.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Like I'm going to go ahead and make one of my early season hot takes. I wouldn't be surprised if the season completely goes off the rails for USC, especially going into that Big Ten schedule. I think that's going to be a huge step up that they're not used to. They've got LSU in the opener. They've got Michigan in week 3. They've got Penn State coming to town. They've got us. I mean, that right there is like 4 games. They're probably not winning. And I'm not even talking about Wisconsin, Minnesota. Rutgers is having an up and coming year. Will they be a bowl team? Like probably, but I think this could be a really tough campaign for Lincoln Riley. And if you'd asked me that 2-3 years ago, I'd have been shocked. One more team to cover here, Louisville. Don't want to overlook this game. They, of course, beat us a year ago. They're number 36 in the 24/7 talent composite. So Jeff Brom's done a really nice job building up this roster to kind of be a top half talent within Power 5 conferences. They're expected to be number 31 in SP plus, but it just seems like this isn't the same team that beat us a year ago. They've gone back to the transfer portal to get quarterback Tyler Show out of Texas Tech. He is in his 7th year, a kid known for a strong arm, really bad kind of injury luck along the way. They're expected to be, strength is at the skill positions. Jeff Brom's known for that, figuring out ways to get guys the ball in space and get your most athletic players going. But it feels like their defense here that was, I think definitely a strength a year ago, probably has taken a step back just from different guys that have graduated, gone to the portal, and looking to, upgrade elsewhere. I'd expect this to be a top 30 squad, but right now we're implied to be a 2-touchdown favorite according to SP plus. They're just outside the top 25 in the AP poll. And you got to think Marcus Freeman's going to be geared up for this game. You got to think there's no chance we're overlooking this team. And reminder, that was our 3rd straight primetime game comprised of Ohio State, Duke on the road in a very exhausting kind of late come from behind Sam Hartman heroic win, and then Louisville the next week. And we were just flat in that game. And that was the game where, we talked earlier about our offensive, Jared Parker just not being able to make in-game adjustments. You got to think, Mike Denbrock alone is a big upgrade in that situation, but getting them at home, getting them in a revenge spot, getting them not on a back-to-back-to-back, like big emotional stretch, feels like pretty good spot going into that one. So 8 easy games. This is a 4-game schedule for Notre Dame. It's Texas A&M in week 1. It's Louisville in September. And then back half of the year, Florida State at home and USC for a pretty tough November slate for the Irish. That gets us to where do we expect this to shake out? ESPN has us predicted at 10.1 expected wins according to their win predictor. And Las Vegas has us at an over-under of 10.5. For context, I think the over-under last year was 9.5. I was pretty bearish. I was pretty set on 9-3. I was pretty set on not feeling good about that Ohio State game. Not sure about how Jared Parker was going to mesh early on. And I wound up being spot on with that. So more of a bearish take for me last year. But Mike, I'm going to let you go first this year. What are you thinking about this team? And you taking the over or the under on the 10.5?
I'm taking the over. I'm not as bullish as maybe some other people, but I certainly am bullish here. I'm taking the over. I think, of course, like any team, there's some holes. There are some question marks, the offensive line in particular. But as we went through our preview and we went through position group by position group, I was just struck with how many units we have that I expect to perform extremely well. We have just across the board, we have experience, talent, young talent, guys who are expected to be breakout players across all levels of the offense and defense, generally, with the exception of some groups like the offensive line and wide receivers. So I think I said I was expecting our defense to be top 5, maybe even better, our offense to be around top 10. I think that led me to the conclusion that we should be a top 5 team this year. And backing in from that, and looking at our schedule, I mentioned that the floor, I think, is we have 8 games that feel very easy, and then we have these other 4. And as we mentioned, as we went through these teams, none of these 4 teams that we mentioned that are true tests, none of them are world beaters. Even Texas A&M, that we think is the toughest game on the schedule, there's a lot of volatility, right? It could go either way. They could be. I wouldn't be surprised if they were really good. I wouldn't be surprised if they were really bad. And then Louisville, with them, they're more of a top 30 team, right? So that's the type of game that if we show up, we don't have a letdown performance, we should win that game. I think so. Floor is very high. I think that we should win all these games, but I'm not going to predict that. I think that just based on what we've seen in the last couple of years, I think we will have a letdown game at some point. I don't know that it'll be one of those 8 games where we're going to be favored by 24 plus. I feel like when you have that big of a spread, it's even if you have a pretty miserable performance, you should still win those games. I think it'll probably be a game like maybe Louisville. I mean, I think Louisville will actually be fired up to play, but I think one of these other teams will have a letdown performance somewhere, 11-1, which should be good enough for the college football playoff. And I think I think 11-1. I think it's hard to be upset with that in really any scenario.
So I know we're not the hot takes podcast. We're in season 4, and maybe I'm starting to get, spicier and spicier here in my, mid 30s. We're going undefeated, man. I don't think we're losing a game this year. And here's the overall rationale of how I get there. Who's the best quarterback we play this year? DJU? Like a totally unproven Connor Weigman that's played 8 games in his career and hasn't been able, has had injuries, is now on his 3rd coordinator in 3 years, has a new coaching staff, has a bunch of new guys around him in his game 1. Is it, Miller Moss with an entire new defense playing? Like, we are sitting here saying we're so worried about our offensive line. We're so worried about Tosh Baker wasn't able to hold down the starting job. Like, what's going to happen if it's, Emil Wagner or Anthony Knopp? Like, I don't know. But those questions aren't staring at Louisville saying they've got 7 transfers starting on offense, including a new quarterback who's a 7th-year senior. This isn't, Lincoln Riley saying, screw it, my defense was so bad, I'm completely starting over. Every coach, every player, you're out, new guys in. This isn't Texas A&M with new coach, new coordinator, bunch of transfers out, 30-some guys off the roster. Like, Texas A&M is going to be running an operation for the first time where 40% of the guys on that sideline, between the coaches and the players, brand new, never worked together before. First day in the office, first day on the job. Like, I just start thinking about the question marks that everyone else has. And you're telling me that, sure, Vegas says 10.5 wins. Sure, ESPN SP Plus says around 10 wins. But in every single one of those games, we are statistically favored. Forget what Vegas says. Forget about all the people betting against us in Las Vegas. The stats say we're favored in every single game. If that's not the time to say Notre Dame's going undefeated, I'm never going to call them undefeated. Like, I'm going to just have to wait for the most slam dunk, like we're defending national champions. So I'm going out on a line. I'm not only taking the over, but I'm taking the over as far as I can take it. And I got Notre Dame going undefeated in 2024.
I think it's very fitting that you're playing Lou Holtz clips during the show, and then at the end go 12-0. I think this is Brett's path to just every season predicting Notre Dame 12-0.
When we go, what'll it take? 15-0. I'm then going to play this. That's like the best Notre Dame sports moment of all time when Enrique hit that shot. We're going to redo that this year for the Notre Dame football team. I don't know if we'll win the title, but I think we're going undefeated in the regular season.
Well, I think, I mean, look, I think all these games are ours to lose. So I think that's a great place to start. And a lot of these, they're ours to lose by, call it 24 points, right? So I think if there were a year going into that you thought that we could go undefeated, I think this is certainly the one. Granted, we've actually done this a couple times in the last, 14 years or so, which is great to be able to say that because not many teams can actually say that. But I think that from my perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if we went undefeated. I think hopefully Marcus Freeman he's kind of evolved his program. He's evolved as a coach to where he can avoid these slip up games where we don't look ready to play. And I guess it wouldn't be surprising to me if we see that evolution happen this year. And that would also be, that would be great for this year. That'd also be just a great sign moving forward. I think it would just give continued confidence that Marcus Freeman was the right guy, was the guy who can get us to the next level. So I think if we're splitting hairs between 11-1 and 12-0, I think that's a great place to start for this upcoming season.
Absolutely. One last take. I should have brought this up maybe earlier in the show. It's a really favorable layout to the schedule. We only have 3 true road games: Texas A&M, Purdue, USC. We are playing a neutral siter against Georgia Tech in Atlanta, literally about a half mile from Georgia Tech's campus. So I think that's basically a road game. Call it 4 road games, neutral siters with Navy and Army, and then really well spaced out. We get A&M in the opener. There's 3 games in between before Louisville, with Miami of Ohio and Purdue before them. There's 3 games and a bye immediately before Florida State. And then another 2, pretty winnable games against Virginia and Army against UC. There's no murderer's row. There's no, oh my gosh, that is going to be like that stretch in October is going to be. There's none of that. It's very well spaced out, favorable home and away splits. I think that sets up well for the schedule. So we'll see. A lot of pressure on Marcus Freeman here. This is a year where it feels like it's get to the playoff or bust. You got to be one of those top 12 teams, and Notre Dame should be well set up to do with this schedule. We'll be back in our next show to cover Texas A&M, and until then, Garish.
Garish.